Kevin Flaherty, college basketball insider, has got a new podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks that you need to check out as well. Kevin, the big news in college basketball today is that Dan Hurley is negotiating with the Lakers, and comparing this to the time that they missed out on Coach K, I think a lot of things have changed, and it feels like he's pointing in the direction of going. What do you think happens with Dan Hurley?
Yeah, I think that he is very much listening. I didn't know if you saw the thing with Gino Auriemma where he said that he was kind of joking with him last night, not realizing how serious it was, and said, hey, you could do really well with the Lakers. You could win titles, maybe more so than a guy who hadn't coached before, talking about J.J. Redick as another candidate, and said Hurley kind of had a laugh about it. And then he saw that, Hurley was legitimately up for the job. And so I do think it's such a fascinating time in college basketball, and that we've seen coaches that you felt like would kind of coach until they dropped, getting out of the sport or deciding to go a different way because of all the things that you have to deal with now, whether that's the transfer portal, whether that's NIL, whether that's having to reset your roster, every other year. And so I think a lot of those things, like you were alluding to, are changes that would make it more appealing to be in the NBA. Somebody brought up Billy Donovan as the potential candidate, if Dan Hurley were to go. And the argument against Billy Donovan, of course, is Billy Donovan didn't love recruiting before all of this stuff. So I'm not sure that this is going to be any more appealing. But no, I think it's not a done deal, and it's important to emphasize that, because as these things can kind of get down to where you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's and still go south. But at the same time, as of right now, it's something that it wouldn't surprise me at all to see this thing get finished.
Kevin, we were talking about this a couple of segments ago. It really does feel far-fetched that a guy would go from the pro ranks to the college ranks, whether you're talking about basketball or football, but plenty of reasons why someone would do so vice versa, specifically because recruiting is a 24/7 gig, 365 now, on top of the fact that you're constantly having to recruit your own guys. I set all that up, though, to ask you, if you're listing the pros and cons of going from pro to college, is there anything in the pros list for a college job over a pro job with basketball?
Yeah, I think so. I think when you look at a guy like, say, Bill Self, who is somebody that gets the odd, hey, he could go to the NBA type thing, one of the things that he's talked about is, the lack of autonomy at the NBA level. And so, he's able to kind of control every aspect of the Kansas program and do pretty well at it. Whereas if you go to the pros, generally speaking, if you go to a bad place, you may not be there very long, because they don't tend to have great job security there. If you go to a good place, chances are that team is going to have a star player or two, and in most cases, they've invested a lot more money into that player than they have into you. And so, being able to really get after your team in a way that, you can say, hey, you're not doing this right, you need to change this. It sounds like something that, coaches everywhere would be able to do, but we've seen that that's not necessarily the case at the NBA level. And it's kind of interesting, because you look at Jason Kidd now and the success that he's having. When he was with the Milwaukee Bucks, that was something that a lot of people brought up, that he was too hostile, that he got after players too much, and there were relationship things there. And so when you look at it from the other way, yeah, there are some college coaches that aren't going to like going to the NBA because of some of those reasons. And there are some college coaches that might head to the NBA, maybe not realizing those things will be an issue, and wind up not lasting a whole lot at that level. You look at John Beilein, I'm not sure he was ever really able to get buy-in when he went to the NBA, certainly not at the level that he was able to get at Michigan.
What do you think happens to that roster if he leaves?
Oh, it's a feeding frenzy, and it's a feeding frenzy because so many teams are a piece or two away, right? I know this is a Baylor show. You look at that Baylor roster, and you could use another center, right? I mean, you look at, I think the roster has one guy over 6'8" right now, and you know, all of a sudden, if you have Paris Reed and Samson Johnson out there, you know, it's a situation where a lot of teams are looking for sort of that one last guy to get them over the hump, and UConn happens to have a lot of those guys. You've got a 5-star recruit in Liam McNeely. You've got an experienced guard in Hassan Diarra. Aiden Mahaney just transferred there from St. Mary's. And so there are a lot of really appealing pieces there. It's part of the reason I think it would be fascinating. I know the candidate that seems to get brought up a lot if something does happen is Steve Peichel from Rutgers. And Rutgers has an incoming freshman class that has 2 5-star guys, 2, you know, projected NBA lottery picks. What happens if those guys, you know, then are able to hit the portal as well? But it's part of the reason I think maybe UConn's best move might be if he does wind up going to hire somebody like Luke Murray from that staff in an interim role, attack the head coaching job in full when it's at a better time in the cycle, because the risk of any coach taking that UConn job right now is their year one could be a huge struggle, because guys could leave and you don't have enough guys out there to replace them. And so I do think that UConn needs to kind of look at that too when they're trying to decide, do we hire an interim guy? Do we hire a permanent guy? Is continuity is probably going to be a fairly big thing. And if you hire somebody new, you might not get as good a candidate as you could have gotten, just because of that inherent risk of really having a rough year one if guys do wind up leaving.
Hurley seems like such a complete package right now. Exceptional understanding of X's and O's on both the offensive and defensive end, and has a zen-like quality that's very reminiscent of, let's say, a Phil Jackson. What do you think he needs to be better at in order to succeed at the NBA level if he ultimately does take this Lakers gig?
Yeah, I'll be interested to see if he's able to kind of crawl onto his players at the same level. You know, when Coach K started coaching Team USA, I'm not saying he never got after the guys, but it was something where I think he had to have an understanding of, okay, I can't coach these guys the same way I coach at Duke. And one of the things that I think is one of Dan Hurley's biggest strengths is his adaptability. And so I think he's somebody that would be able to see, like, hey, this might not be working. I'm also, you know, kind of fascinated. UConn's offense is just gorgeous. I mean, it is basketball art to see all the different things that they have built into it. Luke Murray was a guy that helped build that. But I also wonder what that would look like at the NBA level, where a lot of guys kind of, you know, want to get the ball in their hands and make something happen, versus something that's going to involve all 5 players and make the defense defend all 5 players. I'm a little interested to see how that offense would translate. I think it would translate pretty well, but it also depends on your personnel buying in.
Do you think Luke Murray is bound for a head coaching job soon? He's one of the better recruiters in the country. Liam McNeely, I think, was, you know, he's the one who locked him down. And plus, he comes with a really cool side benefit.
Yeah, I think so. I think when you look at the recruiting stuff, that would be a benefit in and of itself. I mean, we've seen, obviously, assistant coaches get head coaching jobs basically almost entirely based on the strength of their recruiting. In Luke Murray's case, you know, the impact that he had in terms of sort of rebuilding UConn's offense and building that system, I think you can see the X's and O's kind of layered on top of that. And so I do think that he's bound for a head coaching job somewhere. I'd be really interested if Dan Hurley does wind up leaving, if they do decide to go, hey, you know, we'll go interim with Luke Murray, are they able to keep all those guys in the fold? And if so, you know, is this kind of an audition year for Luke Murray where he has a chance to prove that he should be a head coach at the UConn level, even if not it may only be a matter of time before we hear his name surface for other jobs.
Assuming UConn does remain a favorite to win another championship next season, who do you think some of the main contenders are as we sit here in early June, Kevin?
Yeah, this is kind of funny. I'm not as big into UConn for next year as a lot of people are. I think they're getting a Dan Hurley bump, and certainly deservedly so. But at the same time, I don't love that roster as a roster that's going to go and beat people in March. I think you give them the benefit of the doubt, but generally speaking, I'm not sure that they're quite as good as what everybody's thinking. The Big 12, it feels like, has about 35 potential title contenders. When you look at what Houston is bringing back, when you look at Kansas's roster, Iowa State, I think you don't want to say sneakily because a lot of people are projecting them as a top 5 team, but even with Houston and Kansas having what they have, it wouldn't surprise me a bit to see Iowa State win that league next year. A team that's kind of just off of that I think is interesting. Gonzaga brings back 5 guys who started, I think, at least 15 games this year, and adds back Steel Venters, who missed last year with the season-ending injury. They add in a couple key transfers as well. And so they've got that great mix of experience, depth, firepower. I think they could be the nation's best offense. And then Duke, just when you look at what they have around Cooper Flagg, the interesting thing with Duke is going to be whether that backcourt, whether Tyrese Proctor takes the step forward that a lot of people kind of have projected for him in the past. That backcourt is going to kind of decide that. But if you're just saying, hey, let's line up our chips and see who the most talented team is, there aren't a whole lot of teams that are going to be able to go man for man with Duke. And Flagg's ability to defend not just his guy, but block shots off the weak side and everything, that gives them a major advantage in March as well.
Kansas had some news yesterday, obviously, with Elmarko Jackson getting hurt. They brought in the transfer from Mississippi State, which was in the works before that. How do they replace Elmarko Jackson, not only on the roster, just body-wise, but on the court? Because he was going to be – they were kind of counting on him to be a key rotational piece off the bench.
Yeah, I think that Elmarko Jackson – was a guy that you heard a lot of buzz about this offseason already. Hey, he's regained his confidence. He's looking a lot more like the kid that people had projected as a lottery pick heading into last year. And I'm not saying he would have been a lottery pick, but he could have been a very key piece. And I think losing him doesn't necessarily impact Kansas's floor as much, especially with the addition of Shaquille Moore from Mississippi State, but I do think it impacts their ceiling, because there was certainly a scenario where he becomes one of the better 8th or 9th guys in the country. And you look at how teams play in March and in April, there's always a game in there that your bench players or a rotational guy, he winds up winning for you that you don't expect. And I think that Elmarko had the ability to be that guy, to drop, say 12 points in a 5-point win in the Sweet 16 or Elite 8. And so Shaquille Moore, an incredibly experienced guy, has more than 60 starts over his career. But at the same time, I'm not sure that Moore gives them quite as much upside as Jackson did. Kansas is now at, I think, 12 scholarships. They have a decision to make, because they have a chance, potentially to win a national title this year, but they still have that NCAA penalty where they need to give up a scholarship either next year or this year. And so do you decide to go out and add a 13th guy to try and fill things out and sort of, make sure you've got all the bullets in the gun, so to speak? Or do you look at it, say, we're, reasonably complete. This is the year that we're going to take that scholarship away, and next year be back to 13 scholarships. It's an interesting choice for them to make.
Kevin Flaherty. Kevin, tell them where they can find your podcast.
Yeah, you guys can find my podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, all that good stuff. It's the Pay Heed Podcast, and can find me on Twitter at @KFlaherty, KCSN.
All right, Kevin, always great to talk to you, buddy. We'll talk to you again soon.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Kevin.
There you go.